My name is Rachel Dzombak. I'm on the faculty at UC Berkeley, where I teach innovation and sustainable development across our business and engineering schools. And today I am so excited to be here to talk with you all about lifecycle assessment, what it is, why it matters, and how you can go about doing it. So first off, I thought I would frame with why we need to be thinking about life cycle assessment and why that matters. So much of this has been touched on in the class to date, but I thought I would just add a little bit further information. So we exist now in a linear economy. We are so used to extracting natural resources, manufacturing them into products, making services, us using them as the consumer, interacting with those products and services, and then throwing them out, leading to a significant level of resource destruction. And this linear economy is so normal to all of us that we forget that a new possibility could come to fruition in the coming years, that there could be a different model for how we use and consume our resources. And it matters especially today because by 2030, it is expected that 3 billion new middle-class consumers will enter the market. As individuals gain access to more capital, it'll lead them to wanting to purchase, to engage, to use more products and services, which is going to be a significant drain on our raw materials and resources. And so it's up to all of you, the designers that are thinking about how can we make a green future? What is the future of green entrepreneurship? To be considering what is possible and how do we design businesses in a way that reuses and recycles and keeps in circulation our materials and our raw materials, our resources over a longer period of time. This is leading to what's known as a circular economy, which is a proposed economic model that removes waste from our production and consumption cycles. But circular economy is a proposed concept. It's not here yet. And so we need to take a critical lens to think about how can these circular strategies actually work? What are the impacts of them? How do we know when we achieve circularity? What does that actually look like? And life cycle assessment is a key technique to measuring circularity of systems and measuring environmental impacts. At its core, that's what life cycle assessment, or LCA, is. It's a technique to assess impacts associated with a product's life or a service. You can understand what each of the different components of a product and service are and understand what are the environmental impacts associated with those. When you are conducting an LCA, there are a number of core components that I'll speak to in more depth. The first is the purpose. You have to understand why you are going and conducting an LCA. You need to develop a systems boundary. You can't measure everything at once, so you have to decide, okay, what are the bounds of my system? What am I paying attention to? You have to choose a functional unit or something to compare across. And you have to determine what are the impact categories that you care about. What really are those resource impacts, the environmental impacts that you are wanting to understand and communicate about using your LCA. So in this video, I'm going to dive into those a bit deeper and give you instruction on how you actually go about conducting an LCA. So let's start with the purpose piece. This is where you're thinking about, why am I conducting an LCA? I think in this day and age, so many people have learned about LCA and think, hey, this seems like a good idea. I should jump in and conduct an LCA. But as with anything, you want to be intentional about why you're conducting an LCA. It is time and resource intensive. It takes a lot to can collect all of this data and figure out and make sense of it and understand those environmental impacts. So having a clear question in mind of maybe it's comparing across two different sources of energy. Maybe it's understanding a design choice for a specific material and how that will influence the total impact over the course of a product's life cycle. Maybe you're making just a decision about how you want to arrange a service, how you want to set up your supply chain, and you're comparing between different options. All of these are strong intentions that should motivate both why you're designing your study and how you're designing it. So really spending some time with your team, investing in those conversations of what specifically are we looking to get out of this up front, will serve you as you conduct an LCA because you'll have a clear vision in mind of why you're trying to conduct it. The second piece is defining your system's boundary. And this, I think, is the hardest step of an LCA. So many people look at an environmental system and say, this is just too big. I don't know where to stop. If I'm doing the LCA for a light bulb, do I start when that first material is mined? Do I start, far after the product is thrown away and track it all the way through the landfill? Do I incorporate every single element of every single sensor that's embedded? Do I take the lamppost into consideration if I'm looking at street lighting? Where do I draw the line? And there's no right answer to that question. And that's a key piece to remember, is that you are just putting a stake in the ground. This is, I think, the hardest part. Sometimes engineers are more accustomed to that because we're used to making assumptions in order to move forward. But this is a place where you just need to pick to have a starting point. So start out, you can always change that down the road, but start by understanding, what is that systems boundary? What does it look like? Do I want to look at every single stage, all the way from the design stage? Do I want to focus my energy on the use phase? And sometimes when you are selecting a systems boundary, a helpful thing you can do is just do a quick back of the envelope calculation to start to prioritize across those different life cycle phases. So for example, if you're looking at a cell phone and you're trying to understand the environmental impacts of that cell phone, well, you know that the power charge that a cell phone is drawing is actually quite low, and that the bulk of the impacts then could be found in the manufacturing phases, the end of life phases. And so maybe you want to kind of spend more of your energy understanding the upstream manufacturing than that use phase in particular. That would be different if you were looking at a product that had a really heavy and the predominant impacts were found in that use phase, or if you were looking in the context of an area that is dependent on coal or natural gas or different forms of energy versus solar or wind. And so it's up to you to think about, okay, what matters to here for my study? Can you relate back to that purpose? What really are we trying to learn? And set intention around that systems boundary that you are defining. The third component that is critical is defining a functional unit. And this is where you are trying to develop what's a mechanism of comparison that I can use to normalize my impacts across different choices that I'm making. So for example, say you were trying to understand the life cycle impacts of different types of lighting. Maybe you were comparing a CFL to an incandescent light bulb to an LED, and you were trying to understand, okay, how can I normalize across these three? What is a moment of comparison between them? So perhaps your functional unit would be lumen hours. So how many hours is that light lit and how much light is it putting out? Because each of them have a different level at which they are producing light, you need that normalization factor to be able to compare across them. If instead you were comparing between, a styrofoam cup to put your coffee in and a reusable coffee mug, then maybe your moment of comparison would be 100 cups of coffee. And you were trying to understand what is the impact associated with 100 cups of coffee that drank out of either of those two options. When you're doing an LCA in the context of a service versus a product, there you need to be thinking about what's the outcome that that service is providing, and then define your functional unit in accordance with that outcome piece. So there's tons of examples in the literature about what are functional units that are commonly used. I think this is a place where people frequently try to come up with something new and original, which is fantastic if that fits your study. And there's no shame in kind of seeing what best practices are for specific industries, using the functional units, again, as a starting place. You can always change your mechanism through which you're viewing your data and assessing your impacts, but it gives you a starting point to understand, okay, let's just start to get deeper into this decision space and understand what the impacts are across our different choices. The next piece is trying to understand the environmental impacts and really what is that impact category that you care about, because it will drastically change what data that you are collecting and what you are looking to share in the after stages of an LCA. And again, this relates to your purpose question. If your main focus is carbon, and then that is an impact category you can think of. You can translate all of the impacts to kilograms of carbon or metric tons of carbon and use that as your impact category. But that's not the only impact that matters. You might be thinking about, especially if you're looking at resources, what is that total resource usage that I'm using? That could be raw materials, that could be water, it could be energy. You could be thinking about all of those different factors. Additionally, if you're thinking about humans and the humans that are interacting in your system, then maybe you want to be looking at human health impacts. What is going to be the impact on individuals? What risks are we putting them at? And so I'd say that it's a matter of, again, relating to your purpose, but being very clear on what impact category you're focusing on. If you focus on all of them, a lot of the times some of the LCA softwares will kind of spit out, here's the impacts across a bunch of different categories, which is super helpful. And it comes at a cost of not being able to translate each of those into understandable metrics that your consumer, your audience will understand. And so keeping that, what you want to learn as well as what your audience wants to learn in mind, that was what can guide that impact category that you're thinking about. So those are the main principles of what you should be considering when conducting an LCA. And we can now shift to talk a little bit about how. How do you think it started with an LCA? So as I mentioned, there are a number of commercially available softwares that have databases of all of the different impacts associated with use of a different material. And so you can check those out. They're linked in the class as well, of common tools that are used to conduct LCA using software such as one is called Gabby, that is a commonly used platform. That said, they can be expensive and prohibitive. So if you are a starting enterprise and you're trying to think about, okay, can we start just doing an initial assessment of our own impacts, then what you want to start doing is once you've defined your purpose and your systems boundary and you've chosen your functional unit, you want to be thinking about what are all of the inputs that are coming into my process stages? Where are we using materials? Where are we using energy? Where are we using water? Where are we using air? What are all the things? Human labor. Where are all of those things entering our system? How do they show up in our different process stages? On the flip side, you want to be thinking about, once you have that inventory, you're starting to think about, okay, what does this lead to? What does that mean in terms of those impact categories that we just talked about? How much carbon is that releasing? How much tons of materials are we sending to landfill? What is our total energy bill that we are utilizing? What does that translate to in terms of emissions of those energy sources? So it's really thinking about, okay, if I understand our process steps, we have product design, manufacturing, shipping, use, landfill, waste, end-of-life management, all of those different process stages, you want to just be starting to assess and doing kind of a diverge around what are all of those inputs that go into that and all of those outputs. That is, I think, the most time-consuming part of conducting an LCA, building out that inventory and figuring out, where does data exist? How am I pulling it in? That is a critical component here. Once you've done your inventory, and you've translated it to outputs, you're going to take it one step forward to think about, how am I communicating this to my audience? Metric tons of CO2 may mean something to you, whereas it might not mean something to your audience. So you want to be thinking about, how can I support my audience, my customer, whoever I'm conducting the LCA for? Maybe it's internal to my company. How can I translate the findings to make sure that they are meaningful for people, that they're going to guide decisions moving forward for the person who is interested in building out a green company in this way? And so that translation stage, again, there's fantastic examples from lots of professional organizations that I would really encourage you to invest your time in looking. This is the hardest part, I think. The inventory is the most time consuming, but actually translating data to something that matters for folks so that they understand here is that real impact, that is a key piece to making sure that your LCA matters, that time and energy was worth it, so that people understand and can make decisions drawing on the work that you've done. When you are conducting an LCA, it is an iterative process. So once you do that initial assessment, you've kind of pulled in your data sources, you might be on the translation step and saying, okay, let's focus on communicating our impacts, when you find a great new data source that you can pull in and update your metrics. And I just want to say that's a super normal part of the process, that it should be iterative. You should be constantly looking for, how do I challenge my assumptions? Can I conduct an interview and get better data from a factory manager who understands what exactly is happening in that processing plant? You're always looking for ways, new ways to integrate data sources and improve the quality of your life cycle assessment. At the same time, you want to be mindful of how much uncertainty there is. For a lot of the things that the nitty-gritty detailed parts of a manufacturing process or in a supply chain, or as a consumer is utilizing a product, there's not great data publicly available, and as a researcher, it's hard, and an entrepreneur, it's hard to gain insight into the true experience that's happening there. So a critical part of this process also is making assumptions and taking steps to understand, okay, where is there uncertainty in this process, and flagging that. The best thing you can do in LCA is be transparent about what are things you know, what are things that are guesses, and what's your level of confidence in them. And I think it's a thing that people shy away from at times because they say, oh, I want all of my data to be perfect. Well, your data is never going to be perfect. And so it's a matter of, if you can put out where your gaps are, it opens you up to have more collaborators say, I have great data on shipping. Do you want access to it? Or it starts a conversation with others about, it is really hard to track user insights when they're in their homes interacting with a specific product. And that leads to more growth for the field as a whole and different ways we can share data across companies, across research institutions. So that was a lot. How do you even get started? If I were you, I would start thinking about this process of documenting the life cycle. So start with this framework of, if you can look at these kind of core steps: resource extraction, material processing, manufacturing, the use phase, end of life, and transport. Just for whatever it is that you're studying, be it a product, a service, what is happening in each of those phases? Just start by listing out what are your best guesses in each of those phases here. And that gives you a starting point to say, okay, where do I think, just based on what I know, my gut intuition, where do I think the biggest inputs or biggest impacts are? Maybe it's really clear that it's in that use phase. Maybe it's super clear it's in the end of life. And that gives you a prioritization of, here's where I can start with my data collection process, making sure that I have that biggest impact category done first so that I can understand what my major sources of impacts really look like. From there, you can always build and expand, but I think just getting that starting place down, it takes the magic away from this. There's nothing magical about constructing an LCA, but really just this time, hard work, and being creative about how and why you access your data as a way and pull it together as a way of better understanding the system that you are working in. So with that, I challenge you to conduct an LCA, deeply understand your system and the environmental impacts are associated with it, but do it with intention. Be very clear about what you are trying to learn and why you're trying to learn it, so that you can make sure that the LCA you create leads to the impacts and the changes in your system that you want to see. Thanks.